special edition of the My Generation podcast, which we are totally not recording at the start of September. On today's show, as I just said, Halloween special of the My Generation podcast, we'll be talking about movies and their impact with a focus on science fiction, but also for the Halloween angle, thriller, suspense, and horror. Now, as you may know, I am a massive movie fan. I've mentioned it in episodes like episode 8, where I talked about movies that changed your life with people's comments, and also episode 18, where I talked more about Blade Runner 2049. Thrillers and suspense movies are some of my favourite, so I wanted to talk to Joe Finnegan about this. Welcome to the podcast, Joe.
Hello, Max. How are you?
I am very well. Thank you very much for joining me. How are you?
I'm good, thanks.
Lovely. So we're talking about movies today. We've spoken a lot about movies, just pool nights and things like that.
Just a tad, yeah.
Yeah, just a bit. They often run on for a couple hours, our chats about films. But so you wanted to talk about movies that impacted you.
Yeah.
Where would you like to start on the impact of movies in your life?
Well, are we going to go on the horror front first of all?
Let's go for it.
I'm happy to. Well, for me personally, I think when it comes to horror films, at least, I've always been more into the sort of like more films that have a creepy vibe, as opposed to, I think nowadays you get a lot of films that they seem to emphasise the jump scares, and you get a lot of films in the last few years that have come out that seem to focus the scary aspect or the horror aspect on just having scenes that are just jump scare after jump scare. I think I don't know about you, I feel like it's become a bit played out at this point.
Yeah, you kind of want something that's going to leave you scared after the cinema rather than just a quick jump in the moment.
Just something to remember, really, because I think it just seems a little too predictable now almost, where you have a lot of films where... Because I'm a bit of a scaredy cat, I guess, when it comes to horror films. So as a kid, I never really was that into horror films. It wasn't until sort of, I'd say maybe not even my teenager, it's probably like my early 20s and on, where I started to get a lot more into them, and now I'd consider myself a horror film fan for sure.
What got you into them then? What was the focal changing point?
Well, I mean, as a kid, I guess you never really, it's not something you really watch with your family, is it? It's not like, you're not really going to watch like the Saw films after a Christmas dinner with the family or anything like that.
No, although I'm sure someone's done that.
Yeah, that'd be an interesting family conversation.
It'll be an awkward Christmas.
Yeah, for sure. But I think, I don't know really, I can't think of an exact point. I'm trying to think what was the first ever horror film I would have watched.
Ooh.
I think possibly one of the Final Destination films.
Okay.
So, yeah, I think it was the one, I think it was 3. The one, have you watched it?
No.
All I remember, like the scene I remember most vividly is where there's this girl in a tanning salon.
Okay.
And she essentially gets locked in there. So you know the concept of Final Destination films are basically, there's sort of some sort of things that happen that seem very coincidental, but it's like fate is destined to kill off a bunch of these characters because of events that happen at the start of the film. So all of the films follow a fairly regular pattern.
You know that the death is coming, but you just don't know where and when.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's kind of like when you see a scene where, like in this instance, where someone's going into a tanning salon, they go in one of those electronic tanning beds, they close the lid on, and at that point you're thinking, oh god, this is where something happens.
You see, in any other movie, you just they're just going to tan, but this franchise, you're like, I know what's coming.
Yeah, it's like you can kind of, you know roughly what's going to happen, but you're more curious about how and when it's going to happen.
So is that almost the curiosity quite a big thing for you in horror?
Yeah, I think for me personally, it's how films manage to sort of warp the mind, I guess, of like exploring possibilities of what can actually be done. Like in terms of going back to the whole thing about the jump scares, it's kind of like there's a very predictable pattern of the music will drop, someone's probably walking around a dimly lit area, sort of just waiting for that moment where something's going to jump out. And I'm one of those people that will just like, again, it kind of makes me sound like a bit of a coward. But like often when I'm at the cinema watching a film like that, I'll be covering my eyes and like half an eye on the screen. Like
there is no shame.
So
no shame.
In a way, it kind of probably ruins my impression of the film, because you're not getting the full experience, I guess, of what horror film's meant to provide you.
But if it's making you feel that emotion, then in a way it's doing the right thing, because it's almost a fear of the unknown type of situation where you don't know what's coming next. Your mind is creating all these ideas of what you're about to see, but it's not happening yet.
Yeah. I think you talk about fear of the unknown. I think like another franchise that I'm a very big fan of, at least the earlier versions, is the Alien films.
Yeah.
So I think I'm not as keen on the newer films. I feel like it's gone in a bit of a weird direction.
That's gone more philosophical now.
Yeah,
it's more
about the AI and
creation as a whole, rather than the original, which was basically a horror.
Exactly. So I think the first Alien film was fantastic for its time, and I think it's crazy to think it was released in, I don't know what year exactly. It was the 70s.
1979.
Okay.
I don't know why I know that, but I do.
There's Max with the knowledge out of nowhere.
I know a lot of years that films come out in, but yeah, the first Alien movie still holds up today because of how dimly lit they kept the alien. It made it much more intense, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Having this sort of focal point on a particular alien or xenomorph, whatever you want to call it, that is actually like, at that point in time, you don't really know what it is, what it would do if it catches one of these crew members. And I think the suspense of that is what made it so good.
And the claustrophobia of the ship.
Yeah.
Everything's very packed and contained. You can't really move around much, and people are getting shut off on parts of the ship. There's something about sort of being backed into the corner you can feel by the alien. I don't know if you get the same sort of thing.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's kind of the fact that this is a brand new thing, something that's completely foreign to anyone that's watching the film for the first time. So as the franchise has sort of gone on, it kind of lessens the impact a little bit. But definitely the first time I watched the first one, and the second one to an extent, although
yeah,
I think
the second one's more of an action movie.
Yeah, exactly. Like that whole scene at the end where she's got Ridley's got the machine gun.
Yeah,
just you still had that feeling of claustrophobia, but I feel like it definitely had less of an impact.
Did you see Life?
I was going to mention that as well, actually, because that was a really good film. I thought. I think that basically captured the feelings of that first film.
I enjoyed Life more than I think most people did. It was better than I think it was received.
Well, I don't think it was very it wasn't. I don't think it got a massive reception in terms of.
No.
I don't think it was. The marketing was very widespread.
The alien within that movie as well is also quite intelligent. Like there's a couple of moments in the movie, sort of through the mid to 2/3 point where it starts to get to know the crew and does things based off of how the crew are feeling. I don't know. Should we go into spoilers about it?
Because the best part is the ending, definitely. But
the best bit for the ending for me is actually the music.
Yeah.
Like that score that runs for that whole ending scene, without even spoiling the ending, is just so good.
Yeah.
The drone. What is it about the ending that makes it for you?
Well, again, it's difficult to say without spoilers. Just the fact that you kind of assume that even in horror films, there's some aspect of like a perfect ending and everything's going to be okay. But without wanting to spoil a huge amount of it, it feels like by saying that.
Yeah. No, that's fine.
But I think it opens up like in your mind, you're just thinking, wow, what is actually going to happen now?
It is a very open ending, and because you have that whole, your mind starts to fill in the blanks of what's going to happen after the movie. I think that's a really strong ending to a film. You don't even need any sort of sequel. It's not that it's setting up sequels, but it ends on a moment, and then it lets your mind wander about what's taking place in the events of the world after the movie.
I think that's the makings of a great film as well. Not even just limited to horror, but I think any film that sort of has that sort of open-ended situation at the very end where your mind's wandering and thinking, where would it actually go from here? And that doesn't necessarily mean it has to have a sequel, but just almost like a book, really, like how books allow you to sort of picture a situation that you can't actually see what's happening in the text, but you sort of have your imagination thinking of what is going to happen. It's similar, really, for this sort of theoretical scenario of what would happen in a sequel of a film or following an ending or something like that.
It's so that you can feel that the cinematic universe lives on beyond the credit scene, really.
Yeah.
That there is a world there still. It's like a bad movie feels so contained. The moment the credits roll, it's just done. That's it. There's no other rest of the world. But I think that definitely establishes that. Are there other other horror movies that really stick out to you?
More recently, I have enjoyed the Conjuring films. It kind of makes me a little bit of a hypocrite after what I was saying about the jump scares, because they do rely a lot on those.
Yeah.
But I'd say that's a franchise that I have been very into, and I seem to be in the minority of people that prefers the second one to the first.
Okay.
So the second one was more focused on the daughter of the family sort of becoming possessed, and it just gave a very creepy vibe over some of the things she was doing. She was just waking up in the middle of the night and just, I guess, it's sort of like if you picture being in that family and being in that situation.
Yeah.
It's sort of a common pattern, really, of all these films. Like, you put yourself in the shoes of the characters. And I think with a horror film, that's especially impactful because you're thinking, well, I would not want to be here right now. And it's all the sort of potential scenarios you could end yourself up in.
And even the subject of family, putting horror into something that family is usually quite a happy thing. If you've got a good, strong family, it tends to be quite a nice, strong focal point for a movie. But if that's the centre of the horror, you can start to compare it to your own family. And then I feel like something that we've sort of touched on in this episode that I didn't even expect to is sort of how you're filling in blanks and how your life really affects your opinions of movies. So you go in, like what we've said about fear of the unknown and sort of building a world around you. Everyone's going to get something different that they think is going to happen post the movie.
Yeah, I think that's just a common theme across all kinds of films, really, not just horror. You get into that situation where you're watching a film and almost subconsciously sometimes you're putting yourself in the boots of maybe not necessarily the main character, but just the scene as a whole. You sort of imagine being there, like maybe how you would react to certain situations.
Yeah.
And with horror films, that can often be a sort of a trait where you're thinking, no, definitely don't do that.
Yeah.
They end up running downstairs into a basement and getting themselves killed or something. But
yeah, because I feel like in horror there's a lot of tactical decision making, really.
Yeah.
In terms of survival, especially when you've got like zombie movies, you've got threats of people being taken over. The idea of you've got to survive against this threat. So is that something that's prominent in The Conjuring?
Yeah, I guess in terms of, I don't know, I think it's just one of those films where you're constantly on edge, and the fact they're not often confined into a house, that's something that you're sort of quite easy to relate to.
Yeah.
I guess. So
if you've ever had that feeling of being stuck in your own home, and I feel like
lost the keys.
Oh no, I've lost the keys. The biggest horror.
It's probably the closest we'll ever get to a horror film in the house. But
well, okay. Although an interesting
story coming.
Well, a horror. Well, no, this is about a movie. This isn't about my life. Have you seen Mother?
I haven't, no. Is that the one with
Jennifer Lawrence? Yeah, it's an Aronofsky movie, and any excuse for me to bring up Darren Aronofsky, I will. That movie is all set within one house, and it's very allegorical. It's very metaphorical. The house is not really a real house, even though it is physically there. It is more a metaphor for what the character of Mother is going through and the stuff that happens within the house. But that's amazing in terms of what it does with that confined claustrophobia. Instead of having unlimited space and resources, you bring it down to the bare minimum, which is one house, like you said with The Conjuring. We can almost take that back to the first Saw, because that movie's quite a low budget, isn't it?
Yeah. I think, was it the first? I don't think I've seen the first Saw, actually. I think it would have been the second or third I watched. I know what you mean, though, about the sort of just the amount of money they're putting into these sorts of films. It comes across as a very sort of grungy film franchise, and just something where it's not very artistic. It's something like Mother. I've not seen Mother myself, but yeah.
Yeah, so it's like it's stripping it back and not going all out. You don't need big, massive special effects for horror. You can just go quite basic. I mean, the first Saw movie is very, very basic in terms of its budget. It was on a tiny budget. Most of it's all in one room. You said you started watching it the second and third. That's when the budget started coming in for those movies.
Yeah.
But before that, first one had no budget at all. It was an impressive. So if you rewatch the first Saw and you look at how much, I forget the exact budget, but it's tiny. I also wanted to talk about suspense movies versus horror. What do you think are some of the bigger differences between those two genres of movies?
I think we've touched on it a lot already. I think one of the sort of first things we discussed was around like making the audience jump versus making just sort of having this, I guess, creepy atmosphere and just something where you're, I talked about being on edge earlier in the film, and I think when you're having those films with jump scares, that's sort of, there is suspense for that short-term time, but once it's over and then it cuts to a daytime scene, like that's something that The Conjuring does a lot, that there's sort of like, it follows this cycle of having a light-hearted daytime scene where I think in all the films I've seen in that franchise, there's never really been a scary moment in the daytime.
Okay.
And then so it has the light-hearted stuff in the day, even a few jokes maybe here and there, to sort of, I guess, cut out the film, like sort of split up the film a little bit, break it up into the sort of sizable portions of horror, I guess. And then when it goes on to the nighttime periods, the sun goes down in the scene and something is going to happen. Yeah, so it gradually has that build up potentially, and that's where suspense builds a little bit. And then the whole thing I mentioned about sort of the telltale signs of the music dropping or some sort of ominous piano music in the background. Then the jump scare happens, and then it will cut to the daytime, and then the suspense is over at that point, really. It's sort of a very much sort of a short-term, like, adrenaline rush, which goes away as soon as you move on to that next scene. Whereas I think, going back to films like Alien or Life, or have you seen a film called The Fly?
No.
So that was a film, I think that was 80s, maybe 70s, but it's basically about a guy that's doing experiments on teleportation.
Okay.
And it sounds like a really stupid concept now, I think, about explaining that. But basically a fly, like just a classic house fly, just flies into the machine as he goes into it when he's testing it. And it all appears that everything's fine at the time that he goes through the device.
Yeah.
But then he starts to develop sort of traits of fly DNA.
Oh, no.
And then over time, he gradually evolves more and more into sort of picking up traits of flyers, like the things he's eating and like just generally aggressive behaviour, that sort of thing. So I think throughout that entire film, there's a level of suspense because you don't really know what's going to happen to him next, what he's going to do next.
And that's physically messing with the human anatomy, and that's something that's quite intrusive because it's actually destroying his physical body.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's a horrific idea. Have you seen Annihilation?
No.
There's a really great. I'm going to spoil the scene. It's because it's not a massive end of movie scene. You can watch the entire scene on YouTube. I will insert a soundbite after I've said what the scene is because I really really love this scene. So there's this giant wall that's basically just expanding. And I talked about this a little bit on the episode I did with George a couple of weeks ago where we talked about novel writing, where the wall, it starts from a lighthouse and it's just been expanding and expanding. And anyone who goes in never comes back. And what's happening is the things that are inside the wall are merging with the wildlife. So plants are merging with animals, humans are merging with it. It's all the DNA is getting very mixed up, and things are growing oddly. And there's a very, very good scene where some of the main characters are inside this place and are tied up, and a bear enters the room, but the bear has mixed slightly with a character that died earlier in the movie. And when the bear is making its noise, like regular bear sounds, it's mixed with the voice of the person who's gone. So I'm going to insert the sound right now.
That sounds very creepy.
But that's just the creepiest thing. It's such a great scene in that movie. Great scene. I would recommend, because Annihilation actually isn't really a horror that really sticks out. It was like, oh my god, that was really good.
So what is it? I guess
it's a sci-fi. It's
so
sci-fi.
Just not as big on the horror outside that one scene.
There's a handful of horror scenes throughout the movie, but that's the best one. And I really, if you're interested in film and studying film and analysing why films are good, that's a really, really great scene, I think. It makes the movie. But I think, like what you said with, what was it called? The Flyer?
Yeah, The Fly.
Oh, The Fly.
Yeah.
It's
like pretty standard name, really.
Yeah, it's a very easy name to remember. Yeah, it's that sort of messing with something very normal. Like, have you seen District 9?
No.
Oh, that's not a horror either, but that's got, again, the same sort of vibes. I wanted to, again, go back down that route of, so we've got you on the edge of your seat for a movie. I wanted to bring up two examples. If you've seen them, that'd be amazing. Zodiac, the 2007 movie about the Zodiac Killer.
No, I don't.
So I don't know if you know much about the Zodiac killings at all.
A little bit. I know of it, but
yeah, it's not
explain
really.
Explain it for the audience.
I will do, and you're going to bring up some movies too, I hope.
Yeah.
The Zodiac Killer was never found, and the story is of a character who basically they got completely obsessed with figuring out who the killer was, and so goes through the whole movie trying to figure out who they are. And it's a suspense movie in the sense that it's not really horror, but when you're in and around characters who could actually be the Zodiac Killer, it's so intense. Because the scene will just change. It will go from, you're in a very normal setting, and the setting will stay the same, everything's the same, it's just you're in the presence of someone who might be the killer. And then suddenly it's all different. There's one amazing scene 2/3 of the way through, and it's genuinely probably one of the most horrific scenes I've seen without anything happening. I'm going to insert a soundbite here.
Not many people have basements in California.
I do. Come in, Mr. Graceman. The original Studio One sheets I always kept for myself. The cheapo knockoffs like you brought today, I end up tossing into the back alley.
You live alone?
Most Dangerous Game ran in May '69, so that would be about 9 weeks before the first Zodiac Killer, correct?
Yeah.
Do you think he saw the film in our theater and was inspired?
Are you sure there's nobody else in the house?
Would you like to go upstairs and check?
No. Thank you. Thanks for everything.
You're welcome.
And have you seen No Country for Old Men?
No.
That's so you know what you said about The Conjuring and the fact that in that movie you had scenes that sort of softened the pace, where there was day scenes versus evening scenes.
Yeah.
No Country for Old Men is basically a chase movie. A guy has found a standoff gone wrong where everyone in the standoff's died and there's just money left. He finds the money, but then people chase him for that money. And effectively the movie is just one giant suspenseful chase scene, and the person chasing him is a psychopath. Genuinely is one of my favourite movies, and out of all the movies I've probably recommended here, that's the one I would probably say, yes, that. If you haven't seen any movie that we've recommended so far, that's Max's recommendation.
Go and watch it.
Go watch No Country for Old Men. There's so much to do with silence. The movie has absolutely no score, so there's no music, but you feel that suspense. But are there other movies within this sort of horror and suspense genre that you wanted to talk about, Joe?
Well, have you seen A Quiet Place? So that's one I saw fairly recently. And
Yeah.
I think the whole theme, I don't know if you've seen it, but just the concept of it's very sort of mysterious to begin with, and even towards the end you don't really have all the answers. But just the idea of basically not being able to make any noise as you're sort of living your day-to-day life is very suspenseful, because you're just, I don't know how I'd cope in that situation.
Because your fight or flight almost kicks in, because you're expecting to hear noises and there's just not a whole lot there. So any time a sound comes up, it pricks up your ear, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that the film plays to that as well, because there's a lot of scenes where there's a sort of a noise out of nowhere. It might not in a normal film scenario be that big a deal, like just a pan falling over or something like that. But in this film, obviously that's going to have a big impact, because you're so used throughout the film to not hearing any sound practically. I think, yeah, like the score is very minimal. So I think when you do hear something, you know, like it's going to go down, basically.
And it sort of forces you, without even you being aware, to heighten your awareness. Because if there's no sound, your ears will sort of become a bit uncomfortable with that, because it's not hearing anything when there's suspense. So it will try and listen more. So when those sounds do come, I imagine, boom, immediately, that's why it hits you so hard.
Yeah, I think you get that a lot in a lot of films that have those moments where there's just a long period of silence and you're kind of just waiting for that noise, and you know it's probably going to be accompanied with something very scary. So it's like your mind pairs that with the sort of the horrifying aspect of it, and it's kind of like you are sort of just waiting for it and dreading it at the same time.
And is there one scene in A Quiet Place you'd like to insert a soundbite for the listeners for?
There is one where there's the mother is in the bathroom, and
I know which scene you mean. We're going to put it right here. Yeah, I hope I find it somewhere, because otherwise
this whole segment's going to be really weird if you don't actually manage to find it.
Yeah, if I can't find it, the conversation just dies at this point. So hopefully you just heard that. But we'll figure that out on the other side of the episode. Max has got to do a lot of work in post-production today. But that's the way we like it. But so far, that's what Joe and I have had to say about movies and their impact, focusing on thriller, suspense, and horror. But do you have a story to tell about this subject? I know there's some people I've spoken to in real life who, in the world of,
as opposed to the fake life.
Yeah, as opposed to any other life that we lead, about this as an episode concept, who definitely has some strong views about horror. But if you've got a comment about Halloween, horror, what are you doing for Halloween at the minute? Are you dressing up? Are you going anywhere nice? Please put it all in the description. I want to address some of it in future episodes of the podcast. Go back to it, maybe even get Joe on. We had Tom on recently who does Star Wars costumes. Are you dressing up for Halloween? Are you going to a party? Are you just going to watch a movie? Maybe it's one of the movies we've just recommended. Maybe you had no plans at all, and now Joe has sold a movie to you, and that's going to be this evening's movie. If you want to let us know what you're doing, you can contact us here on YouTube by posting a comment below, or contacting the Facebook page at the My Generation Podcast. We'll be featuring comments over the next few episodes, so get your thoughts into us. We really want to keep this conversation going. And you can always inbox the Facebook page. It's always the best way to do it. And all links to all movies we've mentioned are going to be in the YouTube description. So you don't even have to worry about scrubbing back through the podcast trying to find the hundreds of movies we've probably mentioned so far. They're all just going to be down there for you to find. So we're going to be going back to Joe in just a second, but I want to first tease some more topics we've got coming up. we have got coming up in the next few weeks lots of great episodes. Harry's coming on to talk about his swimming soon. I've mentioned that a few times on the podcast. We're getting Dan Inwood back in. He's coming back. I think his episodes were always interesting. You've heard Dan's podcast.
I have, yeah.
Well, what did you think of Dan's podcast?
A very good listen.
Yeah.
The one on life-changing moments.
Yeah, that's quite a ramble, that one.
Yeah, rambles are good.
But yeah, we're getting him back on. We're going to be talking about your hobbies. So actually, if you've got any hobbies you wanted to discuss, we will definitely be addressing hobbies in that episode and other weird little things. When we get Dan on, we like to have a really fun podcast and keep it super informal. And so he'll be back talking about that. And Mitch will be on as well, talking about cars in the future. Joel will be talking about blacksmithing. We've got so much great stuff coming up on the show. So I wanted to go back, Joe, to the crux of why you like horror. What is it for you, if you had to sum it up briefly for me, that makes you go back to the genre?
I think it's just exploring all these possibilities of these sort of freak occurrences that are very unlikely to happen in the world.
Yeah.
It's just like talking about like zombie films and that sort of thing. Realistically, it's probably not going to happen in our lifetimes, maybe. But it's like one of those things where you just sort of, it takes you out of your own world and puts you into sort of an alternate reality in a way of like just a situation that I guess it's a form of escapism in a lot of ways. I think most films are like that anyway, but I think horror films do that to a massive extreme.
And you've touched on zombie movies, which we haven't mentioned too much. One of my favourite scenes is the opening of 28 Weeks Later, if you've seen that movie.
Yeah.
It's not a very good movie, but the opening scene is really good. There's a great chase scene. It's really primal, really intense. I think there's, I don't know if you'd agree, with a zombie movie, you get to kind of let out all your emotions on the zombies. I don't know if you'd agree, in sort of a modern way, it's very difficult to just have a really angry, full release of emotion. But if you've got an army of zombies ahead of you...
Well, there's the whole thing about the sort of the stereotypical nature of zombies, isn't there? In terms of, like, you get certain films where... I mean, I guess typically zombies are very sort of slow, plodding.
Yeah.
And I guess that adds to the creep factor in that if you have someone trapped in a room, there's a horde of zombies like slowly closing in on them, that adds to the sort of suspense and the urgency of the situation. But then you do have some films where, like, it's not really in the vein of a typical horror film, but I guess a typical zombie film, but Shaun of the Dead, for instance, has like much more human-like zombies.
They're very slow in that movie, very slow.
Well, I think you do have some runners, don't you?
Well, they're very slow at the start, though, when they first realise that they're zombies.
Oh, what you mean before? I'm talking about towards the end of the film, where they're sort of all sort of
kicks off
together
in the bar,
and when they're stuck,
in the pub. There's some great scenes in that movie in terms of really, really heart-wrenching emotional beats. Some decisions characters have to make towards the end, which, I mean, you don't really expect from a comedy. Comedy horror is very interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of like, I can't imagine from a director's point of view how you sort of play that, because I guess setting the scene, you want to have that element of comedy, and it's sort of a case of balancing that to make sure that you have the comedy at the same level as the horror, while sort of making the audience aware this is a horror film, but at the same time sprinkling in those horror moments. Because I mentioned earlier about The Conjuring and how it does have some sort of light-hearted moments, but I definitely wouldn't consider that a comedy. So I think you sort of have to go to a level where you're being a fair, like a moderate amount of adding comedic elements, but it's not necessarily going to overtake the horror. You still want those moments where it sort of makes you jump now and again.
Yeah, and it's almost sort of taking advantage of horror's cliches. So I think Shaun of the Dead kind of does that from time to time, where they're just sort of not really caring about the fact they're zombies, just throwing stuff like the whole aiming for their head. Have you seen the new Jim Jarmusch movie, The Dead Don't Die, with Adam Driver and Bill Murray?
I've heard of it, but I think I saw the trailer for it.
It's so funny. It's basically an indie blockbuster. The pacing is so slow, and the comedy is so deadpan. It will not sit with mainstream audiences, but it's hilarious. I love it. It is technically a horror, and there are some horror scenes. It's a zombie movie, of course, but that movie, kind of like what you said with Shaun of the Dead, you have to be quite careful because you're trying to balance two themes that don't always go together, aren't you?
Yeah, it's very ambitious, I think. You sort of have to like really be in your element when it comes to actually knowing how to pace the scenes. You might have a scene that has elements of comedy and horror at the same time, so you sort of have to make sure you're mixing it up but not making the film a complete joke, because then that lessens the impact of the horror, but then vice versa. So yeah, it's a very tricky conundrum I can imagine you find yourself in.
Yes, well, when you're sort of meshing genres together, there's always going to be a bit of risk, even if you're mixing like sci-fi horror like Annihilation did. That was quite a risky movie in that sense anyway.
Well, I think there's a very fine line between sci-fi and horror anyway. I feel like
True.
Sci-fi in itself, for the most part, like even just a typical, like take Interstellar for instance, this is kind of veering a bit off topic, but in a lot of ways you could consider Interstellar a bit of a sort of, I wouldn't go as far as say a horror, but like just the fact that you're sort of out there in space, you've got that whole scene with near the end, it gets a bit strange at the end. I don't know if you've seen it.
Does, yeah. I've seen Interstellar.
So that ending's a little bit weird, but it's just such a unique situation. And again, we talked about fear of the unknown. I think that's a pattern in that film as well, that you see these situations where it's like, could I actually cope here? Would I actually be able to manage this situation? And it's put yourself in the boots of the sort of the characters again.
Well, yeah, one of my favourite moments in Interstellar is when you see that they've gone onto that water planet and you see the horizon just getting bigger and bigger, and then you realise it's a wave, but you've been able to see it for miles and miles, and it just starts getting more horrific as it gets close. That sort of, it looks like something that's quite safe, but as it approaches, you realise the gravity of the situation.
Yeah.
Excuse the pun.
Yeah. I see what you did there.
No, I'm not a comedian. I'll stick to podcasts. But I
Definitely
think
don't make a horror comedy film.
no. I mean, I'll leave it to Jim J. He's. I mean, The Dead Don't Die is really recommended. But in terms of what you said about like sci-fi and being able to in space deal with sound effects and like, have you seen 2001: A Space Odyssey?
Yeah.
Just the breathing outside, that's quite iconic. Because it plays on what you hear in space in a way that you wouldn't expect.
I think the score is fantastic in 2001. So, yeah, I really enjoyed that film. I think, as a whole, like, sci-fi is just... I wouldn't even limit it to space films. Like, if you think of all kinds of sci-fi, everything sci-fi is something that's a little bit out there and something that you're not used to in your normal day-to-day life.
Yeah.
So, again, it's something different, and it's something that is going to be new to someone that's watching a film. Like, a good sci-fi film is going to explore things that have never been seen by the viewer before. So to go into a film like that, you're kind of like not really sure what's going on, and I'd say that borrows elements of horror or like the scary or spooky aspect of those sort of films, for sure.
Lovely. Well, we're going to go back to Joe in just a moment to wrap up the show. I've got one more thing I want to mention and a couple more questions. But there are future topics we're still looking for people to talk about. So, I punted this last week as well, but if you're involved in outdoor sports, we want to talk to you. Maybe you do outdoor rock climbing, maybe you go swimming, maybe you do cycling or mountain biking. If you're between 18 and 30 and live in Kent, I really want to talk about that as a subject. It's not something I do too much of, and I'm very interested. I also want to revisit music in some regard. We've talked about it quite generally with Connor. We talked about it more specifically to indie rock with Leo. But if there's a genre of music you want to talk about, again, between 18 and 30 and live in Kent, I want to talk to you about it. Message the Facebook page at the My Generation Podcast. We might be able to get you on the show in the future. Now, I want to ask one more question in a minute, but my first point I want to end on, have you ever played Halo 5, the video game?
Not Halo 5, no.
No. The
Played the Halo series.
So the Halo series is a shooter series, and on Halo 5 they've got quite a sophisticated... I mean, I'm going to definitely... On Halo 5 they've got quite a sophisticated custom games mode, where you can build your own maps. And one thing that I used to play a lot with my friends on there was the zombie mode in Halo, where if you got killed, you joined the zombie team. You'd spawn in with shotguns and pistols, or you'd spawn in with weapons, and the zombies would spawn in with swords. If they got you, you turned.
Infection.
I didn't know Halo had zombies.
Yeah, they don't have the physical appearance of zombies, but it's the same sort of essence where there's two zombies, 10 humans, and if a zombie gets a human, they join their team.
Oh, okay, I get that.
And someone remade I forget the ship's name, but the ship from Alien, the original Alien, the one that what's it called?
We're editing once we figure out the name.
No, this is staying as is. I don't know what it's called. What's the ship from Alien called? The ship they're on in that movie made it a scale version of it, and so the zombie took the role of the xenomorph, and the humans just took the role of the surviving crew. And they were some of my favourite nights.
Yeah.
Just sitting around with a couple of friends because you were basically in the Alien movie.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you've got Halo, you can download that map. It wasn't my map that I created, but you can definitely still find it if you've got Halo 5. If anyone's even still playing Halo 5. I haven't played video games in like 3 years, by the way, guys. So if that is even still a thing. But recommend it. And I know other video games have zombies, so you can sort of recreate that horror thing. And do you know what? We might have to do an entire separate podcast about horror within video games. I don't know if that's something you...
Yeah, I think Call of Duty, is the main one that has a zombies mode that's quite common across the franchise.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's quite... It's not scary as such. It just has elements of...
Well, it's an
zombies.
adrenaline rush.
Yeah, I guess... I think the sort of, again, veering a little bit off topic, but I think the thing about games is that you sort of build your own world, really, when you're playing it, and you picture the scenario you're in, and in that case, you actually are playing a character.
Yeah.
So with zombies in Call of Duty, you're sort of in a sort of tower defense type game where you're sort of you're basically just stuck in a limited area, confined space.
Yeah.
And you have waves of zombies attacking you. It's pretty much as simple as that. It's as simple as video games come nowadays, really.
Yeah.
So you get guns and upgrades, and you can build fences to barricade them. And yeah, I guess the good part of it, I think the best part of those kind of games is that you have the team cooperation with your friends, or you can play online with random people and that kind of thing. And you just build up a sort of this real situation of like maybe some people take it a little too seriously, like with role playing and that sort of thing. But I
think that's the bit I miss the most from video games, to be honest. And so if you can talk about horror in video games, contact the page, because we might do that as a future episode, actually. I'm sort of thinking aloud here. We've got episodes coming up now.
I've got a few good ideas. There's a few horror games I've really liked.
Then Joe, that can be your next episode on the show.
School dibs.
Oh yeah, he's already taken it before you can even comment, everyone. But so Joe, when we get him back on the show, we're going to talk about horror again, but in the video game context. One more question then before we end the show. I'd just like to ask, because I always do with all the guests, but what do you think you've learned from talking about this openly today?
Well, I think it's just made me realise the variety in horror films there are. We've kind of touched on sci-fi borrowing horror elements, but not always necessarily being horror. So it's kind of like you can see the amount of films that are out there and the amount of genres that actually contain those elements, and just pretty much like the majority of films you watch could contain those moments that surprise you, keep you in suspense, and just keep you entertained, I guess, is the main point of films.
Well, thank you for that, Joe. That is a great point to end on, and we're getting him back on the show already. I usually have to ask most people, but we've already planned it in the episode. So
we obviously agreed this. We went down exactly the way we intended.
Of course. Well, thank you for coming on today, Joe.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Not a problem. And we've got so much great stuff coming up. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I like the ones where we can insert sound bites as well. So if you like having a variety of sounds as well, if you want me to insert more external audio like we have with the films in this episode, or maybe you want less, maybe you just want the raw discussion like we did with Dan in episode 13 where we just rambled for an hour and a half, let me know and we will tailor the podcast to what you like. So much coming up in the next few weeks, but thank you all for listening to this episode of the My Generation podcast, and we'll be back for another episode next Thursday at 6 o'clock. And it's goodbye from Joe.
Goodbye.
And goodbye from me. See you all then. Thank you very much for listening.
Infected.